Dr. Charles Scudder was a respected professor of pharmacology who embraced the practice of Satanism, where he saw the freedom to live his life as he so chose, without society casting judgment upon him. You see, the time was in the late 70s, and Charles was a gay man, so society often cast a judgmental eye upon him. And by 1977, Charles would hand-build a home called Corpsewood Manor in the woods of North Georgia to create an isolated paradise of his very own. It was an ornate structure adorned with pagan art and gave Charles a place to practice his beliefs and also live the life that he so chose. Or at least that was the hope and the plan. But it wasn't long before actual evil invaded this newfound paradise. Dr. Scudder and his longtime companion would be subjected to the unthinkable and their lives lost in the very paradise that was supposed to shelter them from these types of vicious societal storms. Corpsewood Manor would be cemented in Georgia's history as a rumored haunted house, but the truth is, those walls hold the story of people driven by hate and consumed by fear and greed who took the lives of two men without ever gaining any real understanding of what Charles and Joey Odum were all about. Today we're going to be discussing the Corpsewood Manor murders. My name is Misty Sims, and this is Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Let's dive right in. Dr. Charles Scudder said that after talking with Joe, they needed to find a place of isolation after the sensory overload of city life. With his bare hands and the help of his longtime partner, they constructed Corpsewood Manor brick by brick in a woodsy mountain spot in northwest Georgia called Triton, a town with less than 1,700 residents at the time. This home would become the most talked about landmark in the town's rich history. Charles Scudder, known as Charlie to those close to him, was originally from Wisconsin and had been a professor of pharmacology at Loyola University from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s. After a brief marriage while he was still in his teens, Charles met and married the daughter of British poet Basil Bunting, and they had 4 children. By the late 1950s, the marriage was falling apart, and one of the sons had passed away while still in his teenage years. And Charlie found himself changing, or maybe just growing into what he'd always been. So by 1959, after his marriage was over, he moved to Chicago and enrolled in Loyola's medical school. He earned his doctorate in pharmacology in 1964, and around that time he met Joseph Odum, who was 12 years younger than him. And while Charles wasn't formally out of the closet, it was well known around Chicago that Charlie and Joey had a relationship. Joey was officially Charles's cook and housekeeper, and the university didn't see Charles as gay and thought Joey was just an employee of the eccentric professor. The late 1960s were seeing great strides made in civil rights around this time, and Vietnam was coming to an end as far as the war, and there were big cultural shifts happening all over America. But it still proved to be a difficult place for a gay college professor to be time to time. Loyola was also part of the CIA's MK project and mind control studies using LSD-25, and Charles Scudder took part in these studies. Records of these studies were destroyed by the CIA, but published papers from Dr. Scudder gave a little light to his parts in the study, as well as vials of pure LSD-25 found in Corpsewood Manor after the crimes occurred. While he had to keep his work with MK Ultra a little low-key, Charles found himself everything but low-key while he was at Loyola. He dyed his hair purple for a while, then he went platinum blonde. He had a pet monkey, and he even had a pink gargoyle fountain in front of his West Side Chicago mansion, which was built in 1904. And the mansion was beautiful and full of his antiques and items of the occult that he collected. And he and Joey lived there for years with their 2 dogs. And Charles, he wrote a lot of correspondence, which you can still find online if you look. But in particular, he started exchanging letters with Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satanism in 1966, or year 1 of the Age of Satan, according to LaVey. Now, LaVey codified the beliefs and teachings of the Church of Satan in the Satanic Bible, and you can do your own research, but it's my understanding that the Satanists from the LaVey Church and the teachings do not actually worship Satan or the devil or any other name given to this figure. They don't believe that he actually exists, but rather see him as a symbol of pride, materialism, carnality, enlightenment, They reject the existence of supernatural beings and life after death. So it made me correlate it more to atheism, which is a disbelief in any god or afterlife. But when you hear the term Satanism, it seems to bring people to the idea and practice of devil worship, no matter how much it gets explained. And I'll be very transparent here and say that I had the same idea until I talked to some folks and kind of understood the thoughts and beliefs a little bit more clearly. I mean, I haven't made it a secret on this channel that I'm a practicing Christian, so it's almost a natural thing for us to have fear of the devil or Satan. So when we hear that as a practicing religion, it does have your mind tend to wander and go somewhere that isn't exactly accurate, according to those who practice. But as we'll learn from the events we're about to unfold, it is important that we don't let fear blind us to the truth, and above all, bring no harm to those who simply believe differently and aren't causing harm to anyone. They simply see the beliefs of the Abrahamic religions as irrational. They see humans as individuals, and they just want to be able to live their life as they want. They see themselves as misfits and outsiders by nature, and are drawn to the religion or this way of believing and living. And Charles was drawn to this lifestyle, and he was becoming more and more withdrawn from society that seemed to really just rally against him being who he naturally was. He was finding himself even estranged from his now adult children, and the straw that ultimately broke the camel's back for Charles was when he lost both his parents within 6 months of each other, with his father being the victim of a very violent mugging. Charles didn't trust what he saw as a now crumbling society that had turned violent. So he inherited about $40,000 from his mother's estate, and he decided to leave his position at the university and find some land in a rural area to buy and just set up an off-grid oasis that was away from the judgments of his family, his colleagues, and just do his art and be with Joey in complete privacy. He didn't want to stay in Chicago due to the brutal winters, so he went south and bought 40 acres in northern Georgia. When he and Joey found the property, they found a dead horse carcass on an access road, and they just kind of laughed and said, well, I guess our new driveway is going to be called Dead Horse Road. And the spindly, rough-looking trees against the visible skyline inspired the name of Corpsewood Manor. And they had brought a little camper with their Jeep, and they had to camp until they could get back to town for some supplies due to a winter storm that had just kind of wrecked the area at the time. But when they were able to get there, they got what they needed, and they began constructing their paradise completely by hand, even though neither of them had any background in construction. And they started with curved walls, which is long been believed to ward off evil since there's no corner for it to hide in. But it's also a very good barrier against elements. And since they didn't have electricity, this actually helped with insulation. And they didn't have any utilities installed either, so they decided to bury an old refrigerator for cold storage, and then also had a well dug on the property. And they made a beehive so they could harvest honey. They planted vegetables and fruit trees, and they even had a little vineyard that Charlie would use to make his own homemade wine. It's honestly quite wild to think about what these two men with very little experience in homesteading were able to pull off. I mean, this was clearly a sign, I think, of their intelligence, and then also the self-preservation of both of them. And after they finished the first floor, they covered it so that they could move in. And then within another year, they had the second floor of the mansion done. So Charlie was a little after my own heart here too, because he was a huge fan of the Addams Family, and so am I. So I love that he made a little addition to a tree that went up the driveway that said, "Beware of the Thing." I like that so much. But he also kept a very detailed diary, and he wrote about how thrilled he was to be here, how peaceful he just really was at the manor. And then he wrote about, his days and his plans they were all ones of new beginning and just a peaceful existence. And Charlie and Joey spent 6 years at the manor, and they made a few friends along the way. They even allowed a new couple to marry in their rose garden while Charlie was playing the harp at the event. Charlie would make his wine, and other friends would bring different fruits to add to the brew, and they were just truly happy there. And they began decorating their manor kind of early on with some art from the occult, such as paintings, sculptures, stained glass, and other pieces that contain satanic symbols and icons within them. And Charlie also brought that pink gargoyle from Chicago, and they put it right above the entrance to Corpsewood Manor. Now, Charlie told his friends he never actually joined the Church of Satan due to the membership fees, but would introduce himself as a Satanist. But the church does have records saying that he did join and was on the mailing list of the church's newsletter, the Cloven Hoof, which was found in his desk along with many other satanic books. Joey would tell everybody he was Catholic, but Charlie was open to talk about his beliefs and the truth behind them. But despite this level of openness and conversation, Charlie and Joey didn't allow any of their friends and visitors into their actual big house of the manor. They kept that very private, and even though you can find inside photos now on the internet if you look, Charlie constructed a big chicken coop, which was actually a gathering place because it was 3 stories and housed a whole lot more than chickens. It had a level for dry storage, a pretty big adult library, and then the top floor of the chicken house was the one that gained the most attention during the events of Corpsewood Manor. It was a big open room that was painted pink, and Charlie and Joey called it the Pink Room. It would also be referred to by some people as the Pleasure Chamber. And there wasn't any furniture inside, but there were mattresses that were covered with pink sheets on the floor, and it was lit with candles and oil lamps, and there was rumored to have been a lot of items inside that would sort of make you think of like Christian Grey's Red Room if you've ever watched 50 Shades. But that's only really from witnesses. There's no actual photos of the inside, or at least none that I can find. So it could be a slightly inflated rumor, but many friends and the perpetrators of the crime actually gave the same account, so I'm assuming at least pieces of that to be valid. There was also supposedly a guest book for people to sign in, and they would provide dates and then their pleasure preferences. But this book has been lost, and although Sheriff Gary McConnell would say it was turned into evidence, he has no idea what happened to it. So if all that is true, then I'm sure there was someone's name in that book that they didn't want to get out. Not trying to be a conspiracy theorist or anything, but I always feel like if names are getting named and someone doesn't want one to get out, that type of thing is pretty easy to just have go missing. But anyway, Charlie and Joey, they were embraced by the people of their community at one point, but then they kind of started to get to be the subject of rumors and a few ugly remarks, that they were homosexual devil worshippers up on the mountain and that type of thing. But Corpsewood Manor actually became a place where people could go and experiment or just sort of on look, because there's not a lot to do in a small town. Charles would share wine with them and he talked to them, entertain them in the pink room if that's something that they wanted to do. Even wrote letters to people inviting them in for what he referred to as sex and games. And these were strangers, but they would show up. And, some would speculate that he invited strangers up there because it actually allowed him as, a studied man to observe and just see the act of human nature and then maybe partake in it as well. And the games versions would involve some drug use, that LSD that we spoke about earlier. So there was a lot of parties going on, but in no way or at any point did anyone say that anything was done without their knowledge or their consent. Everyone was there to experiment. They were all consenting. Some were young, 17 and up, but that wasn't illegal at the time in Georgia. They were considered adults. But no matter who they were, they stayed in the chicken house area or outside, and they were not to go into the big house portion, with the exception of just very, very few. And one of those was a good friend of the couple named Candace Williamson, who would visit Corpsewood Manor and even bring her kids along so they could play in the gardens. She said these men were warm, kind. They didn't act inappropriately or improperly in front of her or the kids. Their property and the cars were decorated with like pentagrams and items of the occult. There was even rumored to be an altar on the sun deck and human skulls in Charlie's office that he supposedly brought with him when he left the university. So there was a lot going on. But never at any time, and I want to stress that, did Charlie and Joey sound like they were doing anything that folks weren't comfortable with, and they kept their adult activities kind of confined to that pink room area. Other people were free to, visit the garden. They were just a spot of home and warmth and welcoming. And Charlie was said to also be a huge creature of habit. Like, he woke up at the same time every day. He had cocktail hour every day at 5. He and Joey would go pick up supplies in their mail from in town like every 18 days. So there was just not really anything overly sketchy about these men, other than, some people had a little satanic panic. But the sheriff said that the people in the town just kind of were like, live and let live. But soon enough, there would be visitors who were welcomed into their home and took part in their hospitality that would not be their friend. A 17-year-old named Kenneth Brock would be a visitor to Corpsewood Manor. And now, he had a very damaged life, riddled with abuse, and he was taken in by a 30-year-old man named Tony West. who had shot and killed his 2-year-old nephew as a child. And while he said it was an accident, he was confined to a mental hospital until he was 18. Now, his family didn't really have a whole lot to do with him after that, and he even ended up getting in a little more trouble because he shot his brother-in-law later in life, who had just recently escaped from jail. Now, Tony never really served any true time over any of this, but he had a felony on his record now, so he wasn't really subject to, desirable jobs. So he just spent a lot of time drinking and complaining about how life wasn't fair. And in November of 1982, Kenneth met and moved in with Tony in his trailer, and they mainly spent their days drinking and getting high. And Kenneth had ran into Charlie and Joey while he was not hunting on their property when he wasn't supposed to be, but Charlie invited him over, gave him a drink, and even ended up inviting him into the pink room, which he returned to several times, although he said he wasn't homosexual. Now, he would tell his new friend Tony all about the manor and convince him that Charlie and Joey had to be sitting on a fortune. So after struggling his whole life, Kenneth assumed that, hey, if they're wealthy with all this endless supply of drugs and booze, why not me? Now, he didn't see that they actually were living off the land, had inherited the money that they bought the land with. He didn't see any of that. He just wanted what he thought they had. So Kenneth would return many, many times to the manor and try to scope it out, even though he was never allowed inside the big house. By December of 1982, Kenneth went to his mother's and asked to borrow her .22 caliber rifle, which he often would do when he would go hunting, so she let him, not thinking a thing about it. And he would go get Tony. Kenneth and Tony would go over to a man named Joey Wells' house to watch football with he and Teresa Hudgens. And now Teresa was on her first date with Joey, so bless her heart on timing. And Kenneth and Tony asked the couple to come up with them to the manor, which they were actually planning to rob, and they felt the couple would kind of keep, Joey and Charlie at ease. So when the four got up there, Charlie welcomed them right in like he always did and took them up to the pink room and served them some of his homemade wine. The four also had brought a concoction of homemade paint thinner on rags that they were huffing to kind of get and stay high all day. And Joey and Teresa kind of kept to themselves over in the corner while Charlie is entertaining Kenneth and Tony over in another corner. Not anything sexual, just by simply hanging out and talking. Well, Kenneth Brock excused himself and brought back a rifle and ordered Charlie to his knees. Now, Charlie was a little tipsy maybe and was like, okay, bang, bang. Now, some say this was actually his way of just trying to diffuse the situation by being funny. But regardless, Kenneth did lay the rifle down for a little bit and they would continue drinking. But when Charlie went to put some more oil in one of the lamps, Kenneth grabbed back up the rifle and pulled out a knife and would put it to Charlie's throat. And Charlie was like, hey, I'll play whatever game you're wanting to play. But Kenneth threw him to the floor and then on top of one of those mattresses and then started ripping up the sheets to try to bind his hands and was screaming at him to tell him where the money was. Tell me where the money is. And, Charlie was like, being honest. And he's like, there is no money here. Everything I have is in the bank. Well, this just ticked off Kenneth and he starts calling him a liar and then he's trying to rip up more sheets to gag him. Now, Teresa, who truly seems to be innocent in all this, is crying very loudly, saying, please don't hurt anybody, just let us go. And poor Charlie actually looks at her before he's gagged and says, are you okay? That broke my heart, y'all. This man had to know no good was about to come out of this, but recognizes poor girl is scared to death and he checks on her. So Teresa and Joey tried to run, but Tony, by this point, he had the rifle and he ordered them to go back to the room. And Joey managed to talk Tony into getting in the car and them just getting out of there. But when it wouldn't start, Tony said that had to be a sign they needed to finish what they started. So they all went back up to the pink room where Kenneth's still screaming at Charlie to show him where the money is, show him where the valuables are. And Charlie's still trying to calm the situation down and just diffuse it. Well, the entire time, Joey Odum, Charlie's partner, he's inside the big house cleaning up, has no idea this is going on. And it finally occurred to Kenneth and Tony that he might be a better target to tell them where everything is. So Tony tosses the gun to Kenneth, who took off down the ladder. They all heard several gunshots, and Kenneth came running back out of breath and said he had killed that man and the dogs. So next, Kenneth and Tony took poor Charlie, who's still bound and gagged, down the ladder where he was forced to go inside and see his long-term partner, who was dying on the floor with 4 wounds to his head and 1 to his arm. Brock had killed both of their mastiffs, who were curled up next to the fire, so it led everyone to believe that the dogs were asleep when they were shot. So seeing his companion of 23 years lying in a pool of his own blood, Charlie cried out through his gag. Kenneth and Tony made him step over Joey's body and drug him all over the house while they ransacked it. Now, Charlie had made a recording that morning of him singing and playing the harp, which was supposed to be a gift for a friend, and the gruesome twosome of Kenneth and Tony accidentally hit the player and were kind of taken aback when it started playing Charlie's voice and the harp loud through the home. And so Tony took Charlie, he took him to the library, took his gag out, kept threatening him and asking him for money. Charlie kept saying he didn't have any. It was in the bank. They wrote everything and paid for everything by written check. So Tony threatened him with a soldering iron, which Charlie basically told him was a load of baloney because they didn't have electricity at the manor for it to work. Tony walked him out of the library and sat him down next to poor Joey's dead body. And Tony warned him that he would be next if he didn't stop moving. But he just went ahead and shot him right in the face anyway. Didn't give him a chance. And Charlie is said to have muttered, "I asked for this," right before he collapsed. And friends believe he meant because he had invited this evil into his own home. Tony fired again into his face and then 3 more times into his chest, exclaiming, "Now tell me I don't have the guts to kill someone." It's like a winner. Kenneth and Tony searched the house, and they never really found much of any value, a few, nickels and dimes, but they also didn't pay attention to how valuable the artwork was, or it was either too big to move, or those vials of LSD in Charlie's desk. Joey Wells helped them load up the few things they did take into Charlie's Jeep, and then all 4 of them loaded into the Jeep and took off back to Tony's trailer. Tony said he and Kenneth were headed to the Philippines, and they would send for the young couple later, and they then took them over to Kenneth's sister's home, and they ran. Now, Teresa wanted to call the police immediately, but Joey Wells refused. And Joey had his mother, Myra, take Teresa home, and Teresa told Myra the entire story. Instead of being an adult, Myra said they couldn't call the police and took her back to her home where she held Teresa for 4 days. And Teresa was finally able to get a hold of her uncle somehow, and he came and got her. But by this time, Tony and Kenneth are on the run. They had told their families they were headed to Florida. No idea what happened to the Philippines, but they didn't end up going to Florida either. And instead, in Charlie's Jeep, they'd made their way across Alabama and Mississippi and were planning on running to Mexico. At a rest stop, they found a man sleeping in a Toyota and decided they needed to ditch the Jeep, so they put a gun in the man's face and ordered him into the woods. Well, he was actually an off-duty police officer, and so he fought him when they took him into the woods. But sadly, Tony shot him 3 times point blank in the face and then stole his vehicle. And off they took off to Texas. Now, back in Tryon, a friend had dropped in on Charlie and Joey and just found this awful scene. And soon it's crawling with investigators. And the investigators said the stench from the bodies, the dogs, the rotten food, and body odor was so bad there was a cloud of flies overhead, and they had to keep taking regular breaks from the smell. Now, that friend, Candace Williamson, she said she'd never noticed any kind of body odor from the men. But the coroner reported that they were unwashed and unkept, including a long yellow toenail grown out about 1 inch. Which, of course, if you're living the way they did, really, really off the grid, they might not be as kept as normal. But still. So then began the removal of the satanic artwork and a self-portrait of Charlie that he had painted of himself gagged with 5 bullet holes in the head, which was so ominous to me. Well, by this time, Tony and Kenneth had made their way on into Texas and were on an alcohol-fueled-up mess inside a strip club, and Tony told Kenneth just to go on and get lost, which, Kenneth, being the upstanding guy he was, obliged and hitched his way back to Georgia. He finally called his mom from a payphone in Marietta, and she told him about the charges and that Teresa and Joey had completely rolled on them. So he begged her to come get him, but before she could, by some just flat-out miracle, the police showed up at her doorstep. And she confessed to the whole thing. So they were able to go and find Kenneth at that same gas station, and he was arrested without incident. Now, he confessed almost immediately and even told him about the off-duty officer at that rest area. And Tony kind of bumped around for a little bit, but ended up heading back home as well and arrived in Chattanooga, Tennessee around Christmas. He ran out of gas close to the Georgia state line, so he found his way into a local bar called the Palomino Lounge, where he actually saw a police officer, and he went up and confessed everything to him and turned himself in. Well, the officer couldn't find any warrants on him, so he barely even believed his story, but he went ahead and drove him to the state line to meet up with a Georgia police officer, and there Tony walked over the state line willingly and turned himself in. Now, as you can imagine, the case was a complete media circus, and a lot of stuff was getting sensationalized. So the trials had to be speedy, with Kenneth in January and February for Tony. Now, Kenneth took a plea deal to testify against Tony, and ended up getting life in prison versus death for his part in the whole gruesome mess. On February 15th, Kenneth confessed his part against Joey Odum and said that it was an accident. He didn't mean to do anything like kill him. He just wanted to scare him, and he had shot through the door. And he denied shooting Charlie or that officer. Now, he's been repeatedly denied parole, and he did take part in Tony's case, which started in February of 1983. And Tony clung to the fact that he believed that these were devils, and he just killed them, get them out of the way, and his attorneys took full advantage of the fact that Charlie and Joey were Satanists, and that they had supplied Tony with drugs, and he finally had a psychotic break and killed him. I guess he thought he could sway a small-town jury out of fear, but he underestimated them because they handed out the death penalty, and even though it was overturned, he still got 2 life sentences. So what do I think? I think this story has a lot of piece parts that can be twisted and contorted into the messiness that Tony's attorneys were trying to do and trying to influence the jury with. And the truth is, people will act out of fear and do things that they wouldn't normally do. But I think we can all easily see that that isn't what this was. This was greed and no regard for life at all. Charlie and Joey didn't do anything more than welcome these folks into their castle in the country, and they paid with their lives. Based on every account I've read or watched, there may have been some parties and games going on at the manor, but none that weren't among those who desired to do so and wished to explore their more like hedonistic side. Their religion or their beliefs, they're just that, they're theirs. They resided in America, which is supposed to respect their freedom to do so, and it sounded like they had found just the home and place for that, until their kindness fell upon someone who absolutely did not deserve it. Charlie and Joey's home was ransacked that night, and thereafter, with people taking what I'll call trophies, for lack of a better way to put it, and the thieves have been said to have been stricken with bad luck, and some even returning those items to further avoid the dark clouds they felt like were looming over their head. And police said that they always felt a presence watching them while they were investigating. And there's visitors of the manor that have said that they can still hear the dogs barking, harps playing, other sounds, apparitions around the property. So, I mean, I don't know, but maybe part of me hopes that Charlie and Joey are still there with their dogs and they're finally able to live in peace. Nobody, able to hurt them, and they're just living in their castle in the woods that they wanted. I guess maybe that's the only real justice that I can come up with here. So let's take their story as a reminder that we do not have to always understand or agree with someone, but if no harm's coming from it, let's live and let live. We all deserve happiness, love, and above all, peace. Thank you guys so much for being here, and don't forget to click that subscribe button and notification bell so you'll know when I post new content. And you guys, as always, stay safe out there and stay sweet, my cupcakes. I love you, and I will see you next time. Bye!